Security teams need visibility into Linux systems to detect and investigate incidents and protect against unwanted activity. Operations teams are not down with downtime, and with revenue tied to uptime, ops priorities are enterprise priorities. Which is a higher priority? Why not both? Capsulate provides flexible, production-ready infrastructure protection for Linux systems, all without a kernel module. With ops-friendly production security, Capsulate delivers monitoring, detection, and response without adding operational risk or cost. Visit securityweekly.com/capsulate today to request a demo. Are you looking for a solution to protect your web apps against the most business-critical security vulnerabilities? Unleash the power of automated ethical hacker knowledge with Detectify for continuous coverage and relevant security vulnerability findings. Upgrade your web app security with speed and scale and start a 2-week free trial at securityweekly.com/Detectify. Go hack yourself. When it comes to web app and API security, the choice is simple. You can choose Fastly's security solution that teams will actually use in full blocking mode, just like 90% of their customers. Or you can stick with costly options that you probably just turn off. You can get Fastly's all-in-one platform that protects apps everywhere they live, however they're built. Or departments can agree to disagree. You can go to securityweekly.com/Fastly to learn more. Or you can just wish you had.
Welcome back to Aliens Security Weekly. We're in the pipe 5x5. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Our next live webcast will be on April 29th at 11 a.m. Eastern, where you will learn how to prepare for and prevent modern ransomware attacks. Our next technical training will be on May 6th at 11 a.m. Eastern. That webcast will explore common misconfigurations of Nginx, the damage they could do, and how to avoid them. Also, join us May 13th, we're busy, at 11 a.m. Eastern for a technical training with Vycotic to see how attackers gain access to endpoints and learn defensive strategies to protect against those very attacks. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to register now. If you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or our technical trainings, we're getting tons of them, they're all available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. So some news this week. So we get to talk more, John. Thank you for joining me once again. I think the first one I want to jump into is not necessarily the most interesting, but the theme to continue from our previous discussion, our previous segment on surreptitious source code and deceptive diffs, is Homebrew. They had a security incident disclosure on their website, and I also linked in the show notes to a neat write-up from the researcher who identified that basically a 2 or 3 line commit could subvert how Homebrew is doing automated pull request approvals via GitHub Actions. Now, this was designed to be the case where people are busy, let's automate things. And so let's just automate things that might just be a version bump, and that's it. What was really, really neat about this is that the researcher was pretty clever about throwing in, basically taking advantage of how GitHub Actions was interpreting some of this code within YAML. Also, they had to bypass Rubocop, so they were disabling the linter within their very commit and pulling off an attack. And so there were 2 things that were really neat for this. One, very clever thinking, not a lot of work in the sense of characters to write in the size of the diff, but a lot of work in the sense of how to figure out to make this pull off the proper attack. But the security researcher also in their documentation quite explicitly said, we want to put the coordinated in coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So they did this with a really good collaboration to demonstrate with the knowledge and no deception that this is a problem, worked with the Homebrew admins and demonstrated a really great vulnerability that turned into a bounty. So that was a neat thing for me. So I want to show also the other aspect of just good actors within the security community working with developers.
Yeah, it was, as always, we're happy to see these get transparently disclosed and talked about and those type of things. So love that for a start. What's interesting is if you, at least to me, if you look at the blog post itself, it seems short enough that it's not that big a deal. It's like they've relied almost too heavily on links out to other things. So like if I had glanced at this, and And I think I did hear about this last week, but I would have been like, oh, well, okay, and kept going. But as you start digging in, it gets a little more interesting. Sometimes the links are they're not a bad thing, but it's if you're not careful and click through, you miss some of these things, or at least I do. The as I giggled there, the automating the pull request and the merge. You've got to be sort of careful with that type of thing, because the reason we have those pull requests in the first place. And they probably have something set up that they can't directly commit to master, is so that these type of things don't happen. So good learning. I'm sure other folks out there are doing it. So it's a good review, both for people to think about, hey, don't create a bunch of work to get around to security control, which is in place. And then B, also for us homebrew users, it's good to see that they're on top of this type of thing. There's a lot of us who are using Brew now to install a lot of the stuff we've become used to, either as a developer or a security person on our Macs. So it's good to see this level of transparency and paying attention to security. So kudos for that.
Yeah. So if we're already worried about Linux kernel being an attack surface, just a single Brew update can be a pretty gnarly way to get into the attack surface of many an organization. There's also some gnarly ways to get into software from Signal. So this was a pretty fun article that everybody in the AppSec world, in the Signal adjacent world, was chatting about. And this one definitely popped up onto your radar, John. So why don't you walk us through this one?
Yeah, this one made me happy. So I'm going to try my best to cover this without getting into the political side of this, because I think it is a very political thing. Moxie, for those who recognize the name over at Signal, doing awesome work there. Well, let's back up a little bit further. Over the last, 5 years, as mobile phones have become more popular, there has been obviously a cat v mouse game of finding vulnerabilities versus patching vulnerabilities on these devices, whether Android or Apple or everyone's favorite, the Microsoft phone. So the hackers wanted to find the vulnerabilities and get the money. The jailbreakers wanted to find the vulnerabilities and get their own software on the Apple devices when they weren't supposed to. And then the third aspect was companies which were founded around this idea to be able to hack a phone. I'll use that phrase, hack. I'm being, let's say, attack a phone. How about that? I'll try to be good with my words. But be able to attack a phone, usually when it's in your physical presence, physical control, to be able to get access to its contents, right? Law enforcement people or governments, and I'll try to stay on the narrow here. They frequently believe they have reasons to have access to the data on that device. It tells you where that person's been, if they are a suspect in a crime. It could tell you if there are, data on there or illegal types of materials, all sorts of reasons. I think I've covered that enough, and we probably know what's going on. One of the companies in that space, Cellbrite, to use the phrase from Moxie, one of their devices fell off the back of a truck. So one way or another, the fine folks over at Signal managed to get their hands on something which is usually fairly restricted. These type of things are usually, quote unquote, only sold to law enforcement. They realize what they have is very politically sensitive, and a lot of people want to get their hands on it and make fun of them or use them in the wrong way or all sorts of different things. So to get your hands on one of these is probably a bit of a challenge, but they did. However, one way, the truck went by just at the right time. And they started poking at it. And long story short, and listeners to this show are not going to be surprised that the security device had, the security tool had very little security, application security or security in general itself. Cut to the chase. While they were poking around, they realized that, we've been talking about, again, these things come back to the things we're always talking about. There's no input sanitization going on. So while that thing is scanning and getting information off the phone to put in a way that can be easily consumable by law enforcement and indexed and searchable and all those type of things, it's not doing any input sanitization. So it sees a file on that device, it thinks an image, it goes ahead, pulls it in, and runs it through its image libraries. You guys can guess where this is going. Moxie and the team figure out where this is going, and they managed to. And I didn't. So at first, I didn't see this. I'd read the article and I was happy about that. And then someone made a comment that the video is amazing, and I went back and clicked on it because frequently I won't watch videos depending on where I am. Don't want to make noise. And I went back and watched the video, which is quite entertaining. But long story short, they managed to figure out how to. Probably not without a lot of work, do a remote code exploit on the Cellbrite device or Cellbrite software, which, in my interpretation of it, no one's sort of putting up a fight when I said this on Twitter. I think that means that all the cases any case right now which is using Cellbrite for legal evidence, probably plus any case in the past, that evidence is no longer admissible in court, as far as I'm concerned. You've shown really significantly huge application security issues with this, that the data could be manipulated, not just for the existing investigation, but any prior investigation, plus any investigation which happens after a malicious phone has been used. So really the data coming out of that is can no longer be trusted, to come back to trust.
So there's a couple on the software in here. Some of it dated back to 2012. So patch your systems. Keep your packages up to date is the message there. And of course, as forensic software, they're looking at specifically images, videos. These are very common vectors for malware as well, because it's the parsers for them, the codecs and the parsers are so brittle. And in this case, they were just proving the brittleness thereof. A couple things I wanted to add to what you were saying is that sometimes when the trucks are driving around in eBay parking lot, so for example, this type of gear might not be so hard to get your hands on because sometimes processes can break down about verifying who's actually buying something. Not that's necessarily how Signal got across this, but you can find this gear listed on eBay. I'll also throw out there, I forgot to put this in the show notes, is that look up the work by Citizen Lab out of Toronto for a lot of the reasons in the background about Cellbrite in particular, about Signal, etc. But the other aspect too, or two other things I want to go on, John. One is that we've, in terms of evidence and admissibility, I don't think this really makes that big a deal. We've had plain text log files for decades now, and I think that there are going to be plenty of forensics experts who are going to be able to still demonstrate chain of custody, no evidence of tampering, etc. So I don't necessarily think they're the sky is falling aspect on there, and that's where it would be great for us to talk to some lawyers in this area just to see what their response is, because my sense is that it's a bit of a shrug from that perspective, although not a shrug and no sympathy lost for Cellbrite. The one other thing I wanted to go is also to a little bit time back to the ethics, if you will, from our last segment, is that there's a wonderful final paragraph of this Signal post about saying it'd be a shame if you parsed all of these particular files that may or may not show up on some of our Signal apps, which I think is a wonderful deterrent, a wonderful message. But what's interesting here is that if we set aside perhaps the very specifics of these two actors here, but if an app started to go into the cyberpunk and aspect of here's an app with malware equivalent on it, I'm using that term a little bit, hopefully not too loosely, that's attacking other apps. That's not necessarily something or a precedent that we necessarily want to see within app stores, because we possibly could generalize this to cheating in games, those types of apps, or even stalkerware that's sniffing around what other apps are doing. So there are some interesting other areas of this to discuss to figure out what would be a good response in practice, in addition to just what I will admit is a very wonderful final paragraph of this blog post.
Yeah, that's you're bringing up a really good point, and I probably thought about that a little bit, but I mean, yeah, that's to take the I'll say fanboy out of it and actually think about it from a serious point of view. Yeah, how would that app even get through would that app get through a review at Apple if it had malicious content? So that's something. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. the ethics of it are extremely questionable as I think about it. But then again, the way it's been phrased is it may or may not, right? So it's what'll happen? It sounds like it might be part of a download process, not part of going through the app store as I think about it. But that'll be interesting to see how they do it.
Yes, and we'll use this as a foreshadowing teaser. The sort of a stochastic deterrent is how I would kind of describe what they're describing the aesthetics of the files that may or may not be present within your Signal database. But we're going to try and now segue into some other articles that you were also pulling in here. One is, let's see, what's the best way? We're talking about safety and security. So let's go from the device in our hands, perhaps, to devices that are driving us around. Here is another article that you found from Argo, John.
Yeah. So Argo is one of the startups building self-driving cars and the software that drive them. This is a safety report, right? So this is, I think, what was it? Out of 55 pages, there's one page on AppSec. So don't get your hopes too high up. But the reason I thought this was interesting is not so much for the AppSec at all directly, but from the point of view of it gets us, the idea of, when is it worthwhile to go to this level of trouble, or when do you actually invest seriously in I'll say a technology. Self-driving cars driving down the road, you want to make sure that thing doesn't kill people. We all know it's going to happen, and unfortunately, knock on wood, at some point, one of these things are going to, an unseeable, unfortunate accident is going to happen, no matter how much effort we go to. But the industry is trying very hard to make sure they do everything right. And this popped up on my radar. A friend on LinkedIn saw it, and they were giving thumbs up. Awesome job, thanks for great to see you guys going to all this trouble. And it's a safety report. So it's what are we doing with our cars and the software that's driving them. God, that sounds hard to say. But the software which is driving these cars, how much trouble are we going to? How are we testing it? What process are we going through? Are we looking at audit logs? So all the things that we talk about in AppSec, InfoSec, infrastructure security, these type of things, cloud security, they're doing with the car. But taking it's an engineering thing, right? But they're taking very seriously. And this sort of paper talks through how are they doing it? How are they continuing to improve? Even as the car is driving down the road, if they see something which may not be an error, but a tree somehow got flagged incorrectly, they're still learning. And then I just said a page of AppSec. So I think it's interesting to look from that point of view. This is not something that someone who buys this car is ever going to look at, right? That's going to be a paper like this will be taken and consumed and then presented by a marketing team, and that's not a bad thing. That's okay. But you're going to see ads out about we're so safe, we've done this, we've got 5-star rating, blah 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 blah. But this is actually what that means behind the scenes. So I think that's really interesting to think about. When would something like this, I've talked before about the space shuttle stuff, but when do you go to that level of detail to actually really make sure something is safe or secure? So I think from that point of view, it's worth a scan.
It's neat, and it hits that area too of sort of that machine learning, computer vision area of adversarial attacks as well, where we've seen examples of just a little bit of tape on a stop sign can turn a 35-mile-an-hour limit into an 85-mile-an-hour speed limit, something like that, or the wonderful circle of salt, a white circle drawn around a self-driving car can keep it contained therein, which is really neat. So that ties in as well to another article that I came across from the blog lightbluetouchpaper.org. One thing is not updated very often, but when it does, it has some really interesting things. And this one was really neat because it referred to, stochastic gradient descent, which I think is going to be the name of my cyberpunk synthwave band. But they were demonstrating adversarial attacks against machine learning, against big data types of training. But rather than saying we're going to feed some bad data into there or slightly tweak the model in some way that throws it wide open, as we saw a few weeks ago, someone did some really deep research where there was a picture of an apple. a real apple, then a piece of paper that just says iPhone on top of the apple that turned the machine vision to fooled it. That was pretty neat. What this paper is looking at is saying, rather than just messing with any data, fake data, things like that, we can just reorder it. And so the actual order of the data that's being fed into the training model can have introduce some unexpected biases into it. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So one of the things I like to jump around on these topics is we talked about Rust in the Linux kernel and in Android a week ago. So we're talking about, memory safety and that type of class of dealing with that type of vulnerability class. Here now is completely independent of any programming language, and it's more of the data that we're dealing with, whether it is just a self-driving car, as you were describing, or something else that's using this type of training model. So pretty cool stuff. Gets into a bit of heavy math, so you have to have a little bit of understand the specifics of it, but you can also do what I do and just read the abstract, read the conclusion, and bring it over to the airwaves as we do here.
It's funny because it's one of the areas where I actually understand the math. I've done at this point a decent amount of machine learning over the years. So gradient descent by itself is probably one of the first forms of learning which most people learn when they get into space. Stochastic gradient descent is different. From a point of view that it's you're doing more sampling and not just taking the full data set and running with it. What's interesting about this to me, it'd be curious to see how this. I haven't looked at the white paper behind the blog post, but it'd be interesting to see how this actually works in real life. A lot of what we think of as machine learning, or what a lot of machine learning people do spend their days doing, day in and day out, is actually data science. And by that, what I mean, it's preparation of the data so that it can be fed into those vectors for doing the actual training process and then the inference down the road. But usually as part of that training set, or as the data science side of that, and sort of preparing the data and getting that stuff ready, you're going to have usually a pretty good amount of trouble to make sure the data you have is clean, make sure it is randomized, make sure all these things are sort of in place so that the learning algorithms don't, have false positives or false negatives. It's sort of similar to what I have in security, but with a much larger set of vectors and matrix multiplication, etc. So I'd be a little surprised to see this actually working in real life. If any of our viewers are into this space, let's give us some feedback on this. If you dig into this, or you have some ML guys in your team, go run this over to them and say, hey, does this make sense? I'd be sort of curious to see what people think.
Yeah, definitely. We'd love to. Yeah, especially if you also have some interesting papers or types of attacks or even tools, because we'd love to cover some of those areas that are appealing to you or that you want to highlight or are exposing either new vuln classes or just really neat research that's accessible too. We love a great write-up. I'm going to shift us now back to some phones. So we talked about Signal. Let's jump over to another end-to-end encrypted application called WhatsApp. A little bit different model. It uses actually the libwhisper library internally, but in this case, the vulnerability was not so much around the code quality or what was being done with encryption or encryption keys, but the process behind basically account recovery and being able to DOS users, essentially, lock them out of their accounts. And this was really neat because, again, it sort of hit that aspect of what are the other areas all of the areas we should be including, if you will, within our threat models. And, there's certain things that stand out to me when you see a sentence in a write-up that says something like, even WhatsApp two-factor authentication does not prevent the attack behind this latest warning. So it's one of those areas that doesn't mean don't get rid of SMS or get rid of 2FA. It just means let's make sure we've broadened our threat models to understand what can happen when someone tries to register a phone number that's not theirs and attempts to get those one-time codes sent to their phone, don't receive them, but then locks out an account for 12 hours from receiving codes, and then tries to do the same thing with the email associated with someone else. So it's a sort of a intentionally unsuccessful impersonation attack that leads to basically a DOS against legitimate users. So pretty interesting for that perspective.
Yeah. And like I said, this reminds me a little bit of the whole concept of reversing how you do a brute force on a password, right? It's don't keep changing this, don't keep using the same username where you fire passwords at it. Keep using the same password and change the username. I think I hinted at that a few weeks ago, but this is sort of the purpose. What you're trying to do with it is different than what people are thinking. Like you said, I mean, it comes down to the threat model and what are you able to envision that someone might be trying to do with your application. Yeah, interesting write-up. I deleted WhatsApp a while ago due to their owner, but I know a lot of people are still using it, so something to think about.
Yeah. Something to think about, and something too, just I know that's an offhand comment, but one of the things need to keep in mind is that different people have different threat models, and different people have different needs for talking with their friends. So you and I, John, we may just use IRC to keep in touch, whereas others want to use Signal. Others use WhatsApp because that's what their peers are using. So these are the network effects. So that's why the security of all these aspects should be kept in mind, should be secured. And I know that is what you're getting at. Just using that as a learning point for our audience. I'm going to jump to one more. Go ahead.
Oh, just really quickly. Yeah, it is super important. I mean, there's two aspects, and the reason I actually said it is I'm trying to tell people who know me to not contact me on WhatsApp again, right? And like those who I'm in contact with closely, they know it, but like still, I'm sure there's a lot of people who have that contact from me in there. And so it's how do you, and even if I delete that, if someone else goes and registers themselves as John Kinsella, I mean, it's not going to be, thanks to the lib whisper, it's not going to be that simple. But that's an important thing to talk about. What we usually do when a new tech comes out, we'll go and register our usernames so we actually have them. But then on the other end, how do you take care of that? Do you delete your account, or do you leave it there and leave it dormant? So that's a threat model for our listeners to think about. And I'll let you keep running.
No problem. I will say, if you do need to contact John, he has RFC 1149 is probably the best way to get in touch with him. Use that protocol. Speaking of other protocols, really neat write-up about AirDrop. So here's some other research coming from academics. So academics are not necessarily the enemy, despite what may have been the implication from our first segment. But this is pretty neat because it speaks to me in the sense of a protocol review of Apple's AirDrop, which is a proprietary protocol, but the researchers kind of took it apart, looked under the hood, and they saw that there are some privacy positive, to try and be alliterative, aspects to it, and that's part of the intentional design and implementation of Apple in this AirDrop. But what these researchers identified is there are some ways to leak information out of it, and what was really neat, of course, about this as well is that the researchers also proposed some ways to harden the protocol. And one of the things that stood out to me in that proposal, or their discussion of what their thought process, is that they were paying attention not only to the security and privacy aspects of it, but to the user experience and the engineering as well. So they were looking and being accommodating towards performance. And what would it be like to have improved privacy for this protocol without degrading how users would use it and make them throw it away. And that, I think, is one of those other themes that we want to come back to quite often, in the sense of security and developers collaborating. Let's acknowledge engineering constraints, let's acknowledge user experience, and try to move towards that. So hopefully in this case, though, the one unfortunate asterisk is that it sounds like even after a year, they haven't gotten traction with Apple on adopting some of these. So fingers crossed that that this research will nudge forward some of that protocol improvements.
It's sort of tough. I think we we covered this really quickly on an article last year. I think it was last year. Once you've got something out there in the wild, like AirPlay, or this protocol, how do you go about changing it when it's being used on, millions of devices? So and I'm not trying to make an excuse for why they have or haven't touched it, but that's when I read this. That's one of the things crossed my mind. It's like, okay, this is something that's actively in use. You're going to have to not just fix it, but engineer how you do that in a transparent way to the users. And I suspect they've been thinking about this, because you look at the new AirTags. I don't believe this is even close to an issue on there, right? Apparently, Apple or even a phone doesn't know who the AirTag is owned by, unless the phone has been registered with that and then it recognizes the serial number. So they're making it's something that's on their mind, but they're probably trying to figure out how do we scale up something which is there before, or maybe it's just priority. But that's something that we need to think about as developers.
And as developers, we also need to think about not only working with security, but working with our TPMs. And I think this is a good article maybe to wrap up on, because it ties together a couple different themes. And this is an article you flagged, John, and it immediately jumped out to me and made me smile for three particular reasons. One, almost the first line is that talking about what is secure code, and the first bullet listed is the code is easy for someone new to the project to read and the flow is clear. Just readable code in my mind is secure code. So I will, super happy there. I'll be smiling throughout the rest of the article if you're going to set it up like that. And then, of course, the other two things that stood out to me was it was talking about hard things: secrets management, dependency management. These are not particularly necessarily exciting, but they are pretty critical to the security of some software. So that's what really stood out for me. And let me throw it over to you, John, to talk a little bit more about this one.
Yeah. It's interesting. I like this because of the headline. I like this because of the concept, but it's a well-written article. I just highlighted one section that I missed before. This means your app is not only insecure, but likely not meeting functional and business requirements. That's an interesting way to sell your AppSec stuff, right? I mean, that sounds super basic and sort of duh, but anyways, to reel that back up 500,000 feet. The aha light bulb moment to me on this one was, a lot of the larger organizations nowadays, again, the Amazons, Googles, Microsofts, probably Oracle's, companies like that, TPM is a significant role, which most of these companies have quite a lot of these people. They've got some usually amount of engineering background, some amount of product management type concepts, but they're sort of in between, right? They're not the engineering manager, they're not the security guy. They're sort of in a separate space, and their goal at the end of the day is to drive towards those business requirements. Completely makes sense to me, at least, to get those people thinking about security. So I think we just went from talking about developer first security and all those type of concepts, or not all those, that very specific concept that I think a lot of people don't fully embrace. But there's this other group of folks sitting at the table that they're aware of security and they're thinking about it. But I think for a lot of people who are trying to get more AppSec into their org, if you read this and go and send it over to the way of your TPMs, I suspect that can really help provide focus on and awareness of some of these issues. There's several sort of like questions for them to ask. Nice write up at the end. Why people should be thinking about it. So I'm quite happy I found this and that this article was written.
Yeah, and I think another thing that that stands out to me too is that it's a great way of working with TPMs is turn those ideas into execution. Because it's one thing to say, let's have some fuzzers, or we have a big problem. We have 11 commits per hour that we need to review. How the heck are we going to do this? And your TPMs can help with identifying process, setting up process, and engineering can help with where that area can be automated. So I think it's a great way to bring security to projects. So thank you for highlighting that. And I did lie, had to throw in one more article just because there's a pun coming up here. From Project Zero, they were designing Sock Fuzzer to apply to the macOS kernel. This is the kernel that's in iOS, tvOS, Phone OS, iPad OS, etc. And it's the Xenu kernel, so it gave me a chance for Alien Day to mention they should be calling this Xenomorph. And with that, I'm going to have to admit it's game over, man, game over. No more puns from me. But I would like to thank John for joining me once again. I'd like to thank all of our listeners, everybody who's also hanging out and chatting with us on Discord. Come chat with us on Twitch as well. And thanks again. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.